The courtroom on Station Kepler 9 was filled with beings from across the galaxy. Judge Harold Bennett sat behind his tall bench looking down at everyone below. He was a human who had worked hard to get his position in the galactic court system. He wore his black robes with pride and carried himself like someone very important. Today seemed like another ordinary day with regular cases to handle. The morning light came through the large windows showing the stars beyond. Margaret Cole walked into the courtroom quietly. She wore a simple gray dress that looked old and worn. Her hair was pulled back in a plain style with gray streaks showing through. She had glasses that seemed too big for her face and made her look older than she really was. In her hands, she carried a brown briefcase that had seen better days. The leather was cracked and faded from years of use. She moved slowly and kept her eyes down as she found a seat in the back row. The bailiff called out the next case. It was about land rights between a human colonist and a big company. Margaret stood up and walked forward. Her steps were small and uncertain. She held her briefcase tight against her chest. The other lawyer was a centauri named Vexthal. He wore expensive robes that shimmered under the lights. His multiple eyes looked at Margaret and he made a sound that seemed like laughing. The other centauri in the room joined in the sound. Judge Bennett looked up from his datapad. His face showed he was already bored. He saw Margaret standing there and his expression changed to annoyance. She looked like someone who did not belong in his courtroom. He tapped his fingers on the desk waiting for her to speak. The whole room seemed to be waiting and judging her before she even opened her mouth. Margaret approached the table where the defendant sat. The defendant was a man named Peter Hayes. He was a colonist who had worked hard on his land for 5 years. He looked nervous and worried. When he saw Margaret, he seemed even more worried. She did not look like the kind of lawyer who could win against the fancy centauri attorney. She gave him a small smile that was meant to be comforting, but her hands shook as she set down her briefcase. Judge Bennett cleared his throat loudly. The sound echoed in the big room. Everyone turned to look at him. He stared at Margaret with cold eyes that showed no patience. His voice was sharp when he spoke. He asked if she was representing herself. The way he asked made it clear he thought she had no business being there. Margaret looked up at him and spoke in a soft voice that barely carried across the room. She said she was there to help the defendant. The judge let out a long breath that everyone could hear. He asked again if the defendant had real legal representation. The word real hung in the air like an insult. Margaret fumbled with her briefcase and the clasps would not open at first. Her fingers seemed clumsy as she finally got it open. She pulled out a piece of digital paper that was wrinkled and bent. She held it up and said she had her law certificate. Her voice shook when she spoke. Judge Bennett rolled his eyes so everyone could see. He looked at the other court officials and they shared knowing looks. The centauri in the gallery made clicking sounds with their mouths. Their translation devices picked up the sounds and turned them into words. The words were not kind. They talked about humans trying to do things they could not understand. They said humans were too new to the galaxy to know how things really worked. The judge did not stop them from talking. The clerk called the court to order and the trial began. Vexthal stood up with confidence flowing from every movement. He began his opening statement with a voice that filled the room. He talked about laws from different star systems. He used words that were complicated and technical. He mentioned cases that happened on worlds light years away. Every few minutes he would pause and look at Margaret like she was something small and unimportant. When it was Margaret's turn to give her opening statement, she stood slowly. She knocked over a stylus on the table and it rolled onto the floor. She bent down to pick it up and her briefcase fell over, spilling some papers. Judge Bennett made a sound of frustration. He told her to please try to be organized. She apologized in that same soft voice. She gathered her papers with shaking hands. Margaret began to speak about the case. She talked about her client and his land. But before she could finish her first point, Judge Bennett interrupted her. He told her to speak more clearly. She had been speaking clearly, but he acted like she was mumbling. She started again and got 3 sentences in before he interrupted again. He told her to stay on topic even though she had not gone off topic at all. Her shoulders slumped a little more each time he spoke to her that way. Vexthal presented his first witness. The witness was another centauri who worked as a surveyor. He spoke quickly using technical terms that seemed designed to confuse. He talked about measurements and boundaries and legal standards. Every answer he gave was long and complicated. When Margaret stood to ask questions, Judge Bennett held up his hand. He suggested that maybe she should not cross-examine if she did not understand the technical details. The words stung like a slap. Margaret sat back down. She adjusted her glasses and looked at her notes. What nobody saw was the way her eyes moved across the page. They were sharp and focused despite how she looked on the outside. What nobody noticed was that her hand stopped shaking the moment the judge looked away. What nobody could know was that she was seeing everything and remembering everything that happened in that courtroom. During a short break, Judge Bennett talked to his clerk in the hallway. He did not bother to lower his voice much. He said something about amateurs who thought they could practice galactic law with basic training. He said humans needed to learn their place in the order of things. His words were caught by the court recording system. Later those words would matter very much, but right now they just hung in the air as proof of what he really thought. The afternoon session continued in the same way. Every time Margaret tried to object, the judge would wave her down. Every time she tried to present evidence, he would question if it was properly formatted. The Centauri lawyer smiled more and more as the day went on. Peter Hayes looked like he wanted to give up hope. The gallery watched like they were seeing a show where the ending was already known. Nobody thought the simple woman with the old briefcase had any chance at all. The second day of the trial started just like the first. Margaret arrived early wearing the same gray dress. She carried the same worn briefcase. She sat in the same seat and waited quietly. When the bailiff called the court to order, she stood and walked to her table. Judge Bennett barely looked at her. He seemed to have already decided how this trial would end. Vexthal called his main witness to the stand. This was a Centauri expert who had decades of experience in land surveys. The witness wore medals on his chest showing his achievements. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. He explained how he had surveyed the land in dispute. He used charts and holographic displays that floated in the air above the witness stand. The images were bright and colorful and looked very official. The witness talked for almost an hour. He explained every detail of his survey work. He showed boundary lines and measurements. He pointed to legal codes from the Centauri homeworld. Everything he said seemed to prove that Peter Hayes had built his home on land that belonged to the corporation. Judge Bennett nodded along as the witness spoke. He seemed impressed by all the technical information. When Vexthal finished his questions, he sat down with a satisfied look. He glanced at Margaret like the case was already won. Judge Bennett asked if the defense had any questions for the witness. His tone suggested he hoped she would say no. The whole courtroom expected her to stay quiet or ask simple questions that would not matter. Margaret stood up slowly. She picked up her old briefcase and walked toward the witness stand. Her steps still looked uncertain. She stopped halfway and turned back to get her datapad. It was an old model that looked like it might stop working at any moment. The screen had scratches across it. Judge Bennett sighed loudly and told her to please proceed when she was ready. His voice dripped with impatience. Margaret reached the witness stand and looked at the Centauri surveyor. She fumbled with her datapad trying to pull up some information. The witness watched her with barely hidden contempt. She apologized for taking so long and said she was not very good with technology. Some people in the gallery laughed quietly. Judge Bennett told her to just ask her question. She asked the witness if he had used a standard Centauri surveying protocol. The witness said yes without hesitation. He named it the VEX protocol and said it had been adopted in 2847 by galactic standards. Margaret nodded and tapped on her datapad. She asked if this protocol had been approved by the Galactic Survey Commission. The witness said of course it had. He seemed annoyed that she was asking such basic questions. Margaret looked at her scratched screen and squinted behind her thick glasses. She asked if she could approach the bench with a document. Judge Bennett waved his hand in permission. She walked to his desk and handed him a file. Her hand trembled as she gave it to him. He took it and glanced at it quickly. His expression started to change as he read further. She walked back to face the witness. Her voice was still soft, but something in it had changed slightly. She asked if the VEX protocol required atmospheric calibration for different types of planets. The witness said yes, it had calibration requirements. Margaret asked what type of atmosphere Kepler-9 colony had. The witness said it was oxygen-nitrogen standard for human habitation. Then Margaret asked the question that changed everything. She asked what atmospheric setting the witness had used for his survey. The witness hesitated for the first time. He said he had used the appropriate settings. Margaret asked him to be specific. She asked if he had used oxygen-based settings or methane-based settings. The room went very quiet. The witness looked at Vexthal. The lawyer's confident expression had cracked. The witness said the settings were appropriate for the equipment he was using. Margaret pressed on. She pulled up data on her old datapad and asked the judge if she could display it. Bennett nodded slowly. The holographic display showed 2 sets of numbers side by side. Margaret explained, in simple terms, that the witness had surveyed a human colony world using atmospheric constants meant for Centauri methane worlds. Every single measurement was wrong. Every boundary line was off by dozens of meters. The witness tried to argue, but Margaret showed the math. She showed it so clearly that even people who did not understand surveying could follow along. Judge Bennett leaned forward in his chair. For the first time since the trial began, he looked truly interested. He asked the witness to explain the discrepancy. The witness stumbled over his words. He said something about standard procedures and accepted practices. Margaret quietly pointed out that the Galactic Survey Commission required specific atmospheric matching. She had the regulation number memorized. Vexthal jumped to his feet. He objected loudly. He said his witness had 40 years of experience. Margaret turned to face him. Her voice was clearer now when she spoke. She said experience on Centauri worlds, but this was a human world with different atmospheric conditions. The math did not lie. The survey was scientifically invalid. The judge asked for the actual survey data. Vexthal provided it, and Margaret walked the court through the numbers. She showed exactly where the errors were. She explained how methane atmosphere readings would distort measurements on an oxygen world. She made it simple enough for everyone to understand. The witness's medals and experience suddenly meant nothing against basic scientific facts. Judge Bennett called for a short recess. During the break, his clerk came to him with information. She had looked up Margaret's law certification more carefully. She tried to tell the judge what she found, but he cut her off. He said not now. But his face showed he was starting to wonder who this woman really was. When court resumed, Vexthal asked to recall his witness to clarify. The judge allowed it. But the damage was done. Margaret had found the fatal flaw in their case. She had done it while looking like someone who barely knew how to use a datapad. She sat at her table making notes in shaky handwriting, but her eyes were sharp behind those thick glasses. The rest of the day, Margaret continued to chip away at the plaintiff's case. Every witness Vexthal called, she questioned with increasing precision. Her voice grew steadier with each cross-examination. Her questions became sharper. By the end of the day, she had cast doubt on every piece of evidence the corporation presented. Judge Bennett watched her with growing uncertainty. The simple woman who had fumbled with her briefcase was asking questions that cut right to the heart of complex technical issues. She cited regulations without looking them up. She caught inconsistencies that he had missed. Something was not adding up. Peter Hayes sat at the defense table with new hope in his eyes. He watched his lawyer work and began to believe they might actually win. The Centauri in the gallery had stopped their clicking sounds. Some of them were watching Margaret with expressions that might have been respect. Others looked angry that a human was challenging their superior knowledge. That evening, after court adjourned, Margaret packed her briefcase slowly. She put on her old coat and adjusted her glasses. She walked out of the courtroom alone. Nobody watching would have guessed that she had just delivered one of the most skillful cross-examinations in recent galactic court history. She looked like exactly what she had appeared to be that morning. A simple woman doing her best, but now Judge Bennett was lying awake wondering what he had missed. The third day brought changes to the courtroom atmosphere. Judge Bennett arrived earlier than usual. He had spent the previous night reviewing the case files more carefully than he had before. His clerk had left a note on his desk about Margaret's credentials, but he had not read it yet. He told himself he was just being thorough. Deep down, he knew he was worried about something. Margaret entered wearing a different dress, but it looked just as plain as the first one. Her briefcase still appeared ready to fall apart. But when she walked to her table, there was something slightly different in the way she carried herself. The trembling in her hands was less noticeable. Her steps were a bit more confident. Judge Bennett noticed these small changes and felt a knot form in his stomach. Vexthal arrived with 3 assistants carrying boxes of additional evidence. He had clearly spent the night preparing a stronger defense of his survey data. The Centauri lawyer was no longer smiling. He looked like someone ready for a real fight. He nodded curtly to the judge and ignored Margaret completely. She sat at her table organizing papers with movements that seemed less clumsy than before. The morning session began with Vexthal calling an atmospheric scientist to support his surveyor's work. This witness had even more credentials than the first. He spoke about complex equations and calibration methods. He tried to argue that the atmospheric differences were negligible. His presentation was polished and professional. Charts filled the air, showing calculations that looked convincing. When Margaret stood to cross-examine, she did not fumble with her briefcase this time. She walked directly to face the witness. She asked him about his qualifications, and he listed them proudly. Then she asked a simple question. She asked if he had ever actually been to Kepler 9 colony. The witness admitted he had not. Margaret asked if he had reviewed the actual atmospheric composition data from the colony. He hesitated before saying he had relied on standard Earth-type planet parameters. Margaret pulled up data from her datapad without any trouble this time. She showed the specific atmospheric readings from Kepler 9. The oxygen levels were different from Earth standard. The nitrogen ratio was unusual. These differences would absolutely affect survey equipment, calibrated for different atmospheres. The witness tried to argue, but Margaret knew the science better than he did. She walked him through the math step by step until he had to admit the measurements could not be accurate. Judge Bennett interrupted to ask Margaret where she had obtained such detailed knowledge of surveying protocols. She looked at him with those big glasses still on her face. She said she had studied atmospheric science along with her legal training. She said it in a way that suggested this was normal. The judge asked where she had studied. Margaret said she would provide her full credentials when appropriate. Right now, she wanted to focus on her client's case. The morning continued with Margaret systematically destroying the credibility of the plaintiff's technical evidence. She asked questions that revealed gaps in the survey work. She pointed out inconsistencies in the data. She did all of this while still appearing somewhat uncertain in her physical movements, but her legal arguments were becoming razor-sharp. The contrast was striking. During the lunch break, Judge Bennett finally read the note his clerk had left. His face went pale as he read it. Margaret Cole held degrees from 3 different institutions, including the prestigious Centauri Legal Institute. She had graduated at the top of her class. She had published papers on interstellar property law. She was not just qualified, she was exceptionally qualified. He had mocked one of the most educated attorneys in the system. The afternoon session saw a complete shift in the judge's behavior. He addressed Margaret as Counselor Cole instead of Mrs. Cole. He sustained her objections without the dismissive tone. He actually listened when she spoke. Vexthal noticed the change immediately. The Centauri lawyer's confidence began to crack further. He could sense the tide turning. Margaret called her first witness. It was a human surveyor named Kevin Price who had done a proper survey of the disputed land. He explained how he had used correct atmospheric calibrations. His measurements showed the boundary lines in completely different places than the corporation's survey. The land Peter Hayes had built on was well within his legal property. Vexthal tried to discredit the witness, but Margaret had prepared him perfectly. Then Margaret did something unexpected. She requested permission to present additional evidence about similar cases. Judge Bennett asked what she meant. Margaret explained that she had found 12 other cases where the same corporation had used improperly calibrated surveys to claim human colonist land. She had documentation for all of them. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Vexthal objected strenuously. He said those other cases were not relevant to this trial. Margaret calmly argued that they established a pattern of deliberate fraud. Judge Bennett was torn. Technically, she was right that it showed a pattern, but allowing it would open up the case far beyond the simple property dispute it had started as. He asked for the documentation to review. Margaret handed him a file that was nothing like the crumpled papers she had shown on the first day. This file was immaculately organized. Every case was documented with perfect citations. Every piece of evidence was properly labeled and cross-referenced. The judge stared at the file and then at Margaret. She stood there looking at him with a slight smile behind those outdated glasses. He asked her directly who she really was. Margaret adjusted her glasses and said she was exactly who she had claimed to be. A licensed attorney representing her client, but if he wanted her full credentials, she would be happy to provide them. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a document folder. This one was official and bore multiple seals from different galactic institutions. Judge Bennett opened the folder. Inside was Margaret's complete academic record: 3 law degrees, multiple certifications, published works, teaching positions. She had studied under some of the most famous legal minds in the galaxy. She spoke 4 different alien languages fluently. She had argued cases in 7 different star systems. His hand shook slightly as he read through the pages. The judge looked up at the courtroom. Everyone was watching. He had been recorded for 3 days, treating this brilliant attorney like an incompetent amateur. Every dismissive comment was on record. Every time he had cut her off or rolled his eyes was documented. He had revealed his prejudice against humans for everyone to see. Margaret had let him do it. She had played the part perfectly while building an airtight case. Vexthal requested an immediate recess. His entire case was collapsing. The judge granted it. During the break, Margaret sat quietly at her table. Peter Hayes leaned over and whispered, asking why she had not told anyone who she really was from the start. Margaret smiled and said sometimes people reveal their true nature when they think they are dealing with someone powerless. Now everyone in this courtroom had seen exactly how humans were treated in the galactic legal system. The Centauri in the gallery were no longer laughing or clicking. Some looked angry. Others looked thoughtful. A few even looked impressed. Word was already spreading through the station about what was happening in courtroom 7. The simple woman who had been mocked was actually a legal genius. The story was too good not to share. When court resumed, Judge Bennett's entire demeanor had changed. He sat straighter. He spoke more carefully. He asked Margaret if she would like to continue presenting her evidence about the pattern of fraud. She said yes and spent the next 2 hours methodically showing how the corporation had targeted human colonists specifically. They had counted on humans being new to galactic law. They had counted on human lawyers being less experienced. They had counted on judges like Bennett dismissing human attorneys as incompetent. Every case she presented was airtight. Every piece of evidence was solid. By the end of the day, it was clear that this was not just about one piece of land. It was about systematic exploitation, and Margaret had documented all of it, while pretending to be someone who barely understood the system. The intelligence it took to play that role while building such a comprehensive case was staggering. Judge Bennett realized he had not just underestimated one woman. He had underestimated an entire species. The 4th day of the trial felt different from the moment it began. News had spread across the station and beyond. The courtroom was packed with observers who had heard about the human attorney who had fooled everyone. Reporters from various galactic news services had set up recording equipment. What had started as a simple land dispute had become something much bigger. Margaret arrived wearing professional attire for the first time. She had replaced her old gray dress with a proper suit. Her hair was styled differently, showing she was actually younger than she had appeared. But she kept the same briefcase. When people asked her about it later, she would say it reminded her to never judge others by appearances. Judge Bennett noticed the change immediately and felt his stomach sink even further. Vexthal came in looking defeated. His team of assistants looked nervous. The corporation he represented had sent their own legal observers to watch the proceedings. They sat in the front row with expressions that showed they understood how bad this was becoming. What had seemed like an easy case against a colonist with a cheap lawyer had turned into a public relations nightmare. The session began with Margaret calling expert witnesses who had reviewed the corporation's surveying practices across multiple colonies. Each witness provided testimony that supported her claims of systematic fraud. They showed how the same flawed methodology had been used repeatedly. They demonstrated that the errors were too consistent to be accidental. This was deliberate targeting of human settlers. One witness was a retired Centauri judge named Helen Morris, who had presided over galactic courts for 30 years. She had reviewed Margaret's documentation and agreed to testify. Her presence lent enormous credibility to the case. She explained that she had seen similar patterns in cases involving other new species joining the galactic community. Established races sometimes exploited newer ones until someone stood up to challenge them. Margaret asked Helen if prejudice against newer species was common in galactic courts. The retired judge said yes without hesitation. She said that many judges assumed species new to space travel were less sophisticated. This bias affected how cases were handled. It affected which evidence was taken seriously. It affected outcomes. Judge Bennett looked like he wanted to disappear as Helen spoke. Vexthal tried to object, but Judge Bennett overruled him. The current judge knew he was already in deep trouble. Trying to suppress this testimony would only make things worse. He sat and listened as witness after witness described a system that favored established alien races over humans. Each piece of testimony was damning, not just for the corporation, but for the entire structure of galactic justice. Margaret then presented statistical analysis showing win rates for human plaintiffs versus alien plaintiffs in galactic courts. The numbers were stark. Humans lost cases at much higher rates even when the facts seemed in their favor. She had documentation showing that human attorneys were interrupted more often during proceedings. Human evidence was scrutinized more heavily. Human witnesses were questioned more aggressively. She displayed recordings from other trials. In each one, human lawyers were treated dismissively. Judges spoke down to them. Alien attorneys mocked them. The pattern was undeniable. Margaret let the recordings play without comment. The evidence spoke for itself. Several of the human observers in the gallery had tears in their eyes. They had experienced this treatment themselves. Then Margaret did something that surprised everyone. She called Judge Bennett himself as a witness. The courtroom went silent. A judge being called to testify in his own trial was almost unheard of. Bennett looked shocked. He started to object, but Margaret cited a regulation that allowed it in cases involving judicial conduct. He had no choice but to step down from the bench and take the witness stand. Margaret stood before him and asked him to describe his first impression of her when she entered his courtroom 3 days ago. Bennett hesitated. She pressed him to be honest. Finally, he admitted that he had thought she was an amateur who did not belong in galactic court. Margaret asked why he thought that. He said because of how she looked and acted. She asked if her appearance and behavior should have affected how he judged her legal arguments. The judge had to admit they should not have. Margaret asked if he had interrupted her more than he interrupted Vexthal. He said probably yes. She asked if he had reviewed the case file thoroughly before trial. He admitted he had not. She asked why not. He had no good answer. She asked if he would have been more prepared if the defense attorney had been a Centauri instead of a human. The silence that followed was answer enough. Margaret pulled up the recording of Bennett in the hallway saying, "Humans needed to learn their place." She played it for the courtroom. Bennett's face turned red. She asked if this reflected his actual views. He stammered and said he had been frustrated. She asked if he was often frustrated by humans in his courtroom. He admitted that yes, he found human attorneys less polished than their alien counterparts. Then Margaret asked the question that would be quoted in law schools for years to come. She asked if he thought humans were intellectually inferior to other galactic species. Judge Bennett knew his answer would define the rest of his career. He sat there for a long moment. Then he said no, but he had acted as if they were. He admitted his prejudice openly in front of everyone. It was the first honest thing he had said all week. Margaret thanked him and allowed him to return to the bench. The damage was done. The judge had admitted his bias on the record, but Margaret was not cruel. She did not press him further. She had made her point. The system was broken, and even those within it could acknowledge that fact when confronted with the truth. The afternoon session focused on the specific case at hand. Margaret showed beyond any doubt that Peter Hayes owned the land he had settled. The corporation's survey was fraudulent. Their claim was baseless. But more than that, she showed how. The corporation had counted on the legal system to favor them over a human colonist. They had assumed no judge would side with a human over a Centauri corporation. They had been wrong. Vexthal made a last attempt to salvage something. He argued that mistakes in surveys happened and did not prove fraud. Margaret calmly showed emails between corporate officials discussing how to maximize land claims from human colonies. The email specifically mentioned that humans would not have the legal expertise to fight back. The evidence of intentional fraud was overwhelming. The corporation's observers left the courtroom quickly. They knew what was coming. Vexthal sat down, looking exhausted. He had lost, and he knew it. But this was more than a loss. This was a complete exposure of corrupt practices. His reputation would suffer. The corporation would face consequences far beyond this single case. Margaret gave her closing argument without notes. She spoke about humanity's journey to the stars. She talked about how humans had worked hard to earn their place in the galactic community. She described the challenges of being the newest species among ancient civilizations. And she explained that humans would not accept being treated as lesser beings. They would learn the systems, they would master the law, they would demand equality. She pointed out that she had proven herself capable of competing with the best legal minds in the galaxy, but she should not have had to disguise herself to get a fair hearing. Every human attorney deserved respect from the start. Every human litigant deserved justice regardless of their species. The system had to change, and this case was the beginning of that change. The courtroom was absolutely silent when she finished. Even the alien observers seemed moved by her words. She had not just won a case. She had challenged the entire structure of galactic justice, and she had done it by being smarter and more prepared than anyone else in the room. She had proven that underestimating humans was a mistake that would cost those who made it. Judge Bennett called for a recess before delivering his verdict. He needed time to think about what he would say. His words would be remembered and analyzed. He had a chance to be part of the change or to be remembered as an example of the old broken system. Margaret packed her briefcase and waited. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to the judge to decide what kind of justice he believed in. Judge Bennett sat alone in his chambers staring at the wall. The recess had been going for over an hour. His clerk had brought him coffee twice, but both cups sat untouched on his desk, growing cold. He had presided over hundreds of cases in his career. None of them had made him question everything the way this one had. The weight of what he had to decide pressed down on him like a physical force. Outside the courtroom, the station was buzzing with activity. News of the trial had spread to every corner of Kepler 9 and beyond. Human settlers across dozens of colonies were watching and waiting. They had all experienced similar treatment in legal matters. This case had become a symbol for all of them. If Margaret could win here, it would open doors throughout the galactic justice system. If she lost, it would confirm what many humans feared, that they would never be treated as equals. Margaret sat in a small waiting room with Peter Hayes. The colonist was nervous and kept asking if she thought they would win. Margaret told him the evidence was clear and the law was on their side. But she also knew that evidence and law sometimes mattered less than politics and prejudice. She had exposed Judge Bennett's bias publicly. He might rule against them out of anger or embarrassment. Or he might do the right thing. They would know soon enough. Bexthal and the corporate representatives were in a different room having urgent discussions. Phone calls were being made to their headquarters. The corporation was already facing problems beyond this trial. 3 other colonies had filed lawsuits within the past day. Human rights organizations were calling for investigations. The Galactic Commerce Board was asking questions. What had seemed like a routine land grab had turned into a corporate crisis. The gallery was still full when the recess finally ended. People had waited patiently, knowing that what happened next would matter. Human observers sat with expressions ranging from hope to anxiety. Alien observers watched with curiosity and some with concern. The entire dynamic between species felt like it was shifting. Judge Bennett's decision would either slow that shift or accelerate it. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Bennett entered looking tired but composed. He had changed into fresh robes and carried himself with careful dignity. He sat at the bench and looked out at the crowded courtroom. His eyes found Margaret and stayed there for a moment. She looked back at him calmly, waiting. Whatever happened, she had already accomplished something important. Bennett began by addressing the court. He said he had spent the recess in deep reflection about this case and about his conduct during the trial. He acknowledged that he had not given the defense the respect it deserved from the beginning. He admitted that his treatment of Counselor Cole had been influenced by preconceptions about her capabilities based on her appearance and species. He said these were failures on his part as a judge. The apology was genuine and painful to watch. Bennett was not a bad person. He was someone who had absorbed the prejudices of the system he worked in. He had never questioned those prejudices until Margaret forced him to see them clearly. Now he was trying to be better. Whether it was too late for his career remained to be seen. But at least he was trying. Then Bennett turned to the actual case. He said the evidence presented by the defense was overwhelming. The corporation's survey was scientifically invalid due to improper atmospheric calibration. The correct survey showed that Peter Hayes had built his home well within his legal property boundaries. The corporation's claim had no merit. He ruled in favor of the defendant on all counts. Peter Hayes let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. Margaret put a hand on his shoulder and smiled. Around them, humans in the gallery began to quietly celebrate. But Bennett was not finished speaking. He said he was going further than just this case. He was ordering a full investigation into the corporation's surveying practices across all human colonies. Any land claimed through fraudulent surveys would be returned to the rightful owners. The corporate representatives looked sick. This was worse than losing one case. This could cost them millions and destroy their reputation. Vextal sat frozen in his seat. His career had just taken a massive hit. No corporation would want to hire an attorney who had lost this publicly, and this badly. Margaret felt a moment of sympathy for him, but it passed quickly. He had been part of a system that exploited vulnerable people. Consequences were appropriate, but Judge Bennett still had more to say. He announced that he was referring his own conduct during this trial to the Judicial Ethics Committee. He said he could not undo his prejudiced behavior, but he could ensure it was properly reviewed. He would accept whatever consequences came from that review. He hoped his example would encourage other judges to examine their own biases. Then he looked directly at Margaret. He said she had taught him an important lesson about assumptions and prejudice. She had also demonstrated legal skills that ranked with the best he had seen in his career. He formally apologized to her for his treatment and thanked her for having the courage to expose systemic problems in the galactic courts. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Margaret stood and addressed the judge. She said she accepted his apology and respected his willingness to face consequences. She said she hoped he would use this experience to become an advocate for equal treatment of all species. The galaxy needed judges who could recognize their own biases and work to overcome them. She believed he could be that kind of judge if he chose to be. The graciousness of her response surprised many in the courtroom. She could have been vengeful. She could have demanded harsh punishment. Instead, she offered a path forward that acknowledged both accountability and growth. It was a very human response. Many alien species had different concepts of justice that focused more on punishment. Margaret showed that humans valued redemption alongside consequences. Bennett closed the trial and dismissed the court. As people began to file out, reporters rushed forward trying to get statements from everyone involved. Margaret politely declined to comment beyond saying she was pleased with the outcome. Peter Hayes was too emotional to say much. He kept thanking Margaret over and over. She hugged him and told him to go home to his land and his family. The Centauri observers left quickly, avoiding the press. Vextal gathered his materials in silence. A few human attorneys who had been watching approached Margaret. They asked if she would be willing to help them with similar cases. She said yes. She gave them her contact information and said she would make herself available to support human legal rights across the colonies. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret finally sat down alone at the defense table. She opened her old briefcase and looked at the contents. Inside were impeccably organized files and advanced legal texts. The briefcase had always been just a prop, a way to appear less threatening and more sympathetic. She had played her role perfectly and achieved exactly what she had set out to do. Judge Bennett appeared from his chambers. Most people had left by now. He approached Margaret hesitantly. She looked up at him and waited. He asked if she had planned all of this from the beginning. She said yes. She explained that she was actually an investigator for the Galactic Court Ethics Committee. This case had been flagged months ago as potentially involving judicial bias. She had volunteered to test those allegations personally. The judge closed his eyes and nodded. He had suspected something like this, but having it confirmed still hurt. Margaret told him that his conduct had been consistent with patterns observed in many galactic courts. The problem was systemic, not individual. But individuals still had to be held accountable. He asked what would happen to him now. She said that was up to the ethics committee, but she would include in her report his genuine remorse and his willingness to change. Bennett thanked her and left. Margaret packed up her briefcase for the last time in this courtroom. She had other cases to investigate and other judges to test. The work of fixing a broken system was just beginning. But today had been a good start. Today, humans had proven they could compete with any species in the galaxy when given a fair chance. That message would spread far and wide. Outside the courthouse station, workers had gathered. When Margaret emerged, they began to applaud. She stopped, surprised by the reception. These were ordinary people who had watched the trial on public feeds. They were humans and aliens alike. The humans were celebrating a victory for their species. Some of the aliens were celebrating something else. They were celebrating the idea that justice could prevail over prejudice when someone had the courage to demand it. The news from Kepler-9 spread through the galactic communication networks faster than anyone expected. Within hours, every major news service was covering the story. The simple woman who had been a brilliant attorney in disguise became the lead story across hundreds of worlds. Video clips of Judge Bennett's dismissive treatment played alongside clips of Margaret's devastating cross-examinations. The contrast made the story irresistible. On Earth, the reaction was enormous. Margaret Cole became an instant hero to billions of humans. Her picture appeared on news feeds and social media. People analyzed every moment of the trial. Law students studied her tactics. Parents told their children about the woman who had outsmarted an entire courtroom. She represented something humans desperately wanted to believe about themselves, that they could compete with ancient alien civilizations through intelligence and determination. But the reaction was not uniformly positive across the galaxy. Many established alien species felt threatened by the implications. If humans could master galactic law this quickly, what else might they master? Some commentators argued that Margaret was an exception, not representative of humanity as a whole. Others worried that humans would use this victory to demand changes to systems that had worked for thousands of years. The Centauri government issued a formal statement. They condemned the corporation's fraudulent surveying practices. They promised to investigate all land claims involving human colonies. They emphasized that the actions of one company did not reflect Centauri values. But privately, Centauri officials were concerned. Humans were proving to be more formidable than anticipated. Relationships would need to be recalibrated. Margaret returned to her actual office at the Galactic Court Ethics Committee headquarters on Luna Station. Her supervisor was a human woman named Linda Gray, who had worked in galactic courts for 20 years. Linda greeted Margaret with a huge smile and a stack of messages. Everyone wanted to talk to the attorney who had exposed systemic bias so brilliantly. Interview requests came from across the galaxy. Margaret declined most of the interview requests. She agreed to one session with a respected legal journalism service. During that interview, she emphasized that she was not special. Any human attorney with proper training could do what she had done. The problem was that humans were not being given chances to prove themselves. The system assumed incompetence and then pointed to failures as proof. Breaking that cycle required demonstrating competence so clearly it could not be denied. The interviewer asked if she had enjoyed fooling Judge Bennett. Margaret said no. She had taken no pleasure in the deception. It had been necessary to document the bias in a way that could not be disputed. If she had shown up as a credentialed expert, the judge would have behaved differently. The whole point was to show how humans were treated when they appeared vulnerable. The results spoke for themselves. Within days of the verdict, 3 things happened that changed the landscape of galactic justice. First, the Galactic Court Ethics Committee announced a comprehensive review of judicial conduct in cases involving human litigants. They would examine thousands of cases looking for patterns of bias. Margaret was appointed to lead the review team. Her reputation gave the investigation credibility that it might not have had otherwise. Second, a coalition of human rights organizations filed a class action lawsuit against the Colonial Development Corporation. They represented over 2,000 colonists across 15 worlds. All claimed their land had been stolen through fraudulent surveys. The corporation's stock value collapsed. Their executives faced criminal charges on multiple worlds. What had started as one case in one courtroom was destroying an entire corporate empire. Third, the Galactic Bar Association announced new training requirements for all judges. They would have to complete courses on species bias and cultural competency. The courses would be taught by experts from various species, including several humans. Judge Bennett himself volunteered to help develop the curriculum. He wanted to turn his mistakes into something that could help others avoid them. Margaret's office was flooded with requests from human attorneys seeking advice. Many had cases they believed involved bias but did not know how to prove it. Margaret began holding weekly virtual seminars teaching strategy and tactics. She showed other attorneys how to document prejudice, how to build unassailable cases, how to use the system's own rules against those who would abuse them. She also began recruiting. The ethics committee needed investigators who could blend in and observe judicial conduct. Margaret looked for attorneys who could play roles convincingly. She found a retired teacher named George Palmer, who could seem confused and overwhelmed. She found a young attorney named Susan King, who could appear nervous and uncertain. Each had the skills to document bias while seeming harmless. The team Margaret built began investigating courts across the galaxy. They found that bias against humans was common but not universal. Some judges were fair and some were not. The investigators documented everything. Within 6 months, they had enough evidence to begin formal proceedings against 12 judges. Judge Bennett's case had opened a door and now light was flooding through it. But there was resistance. Some alien species resented what they saw as human aggressiveness. Articles appeared arguing that humans were using victimhood to gain unfair advantages, that they were too sensitive about normal courtroom procedures, that Margaret's tactics had been dishonest and should not be celebrated. The backlash was significant, especially among species that had dominated galactic institutions for millennia. Margaret addressed these criticisms head-on. She pointed out that asking for equal treatment was not seeking advantage, that documenting actual bias was not being oversensitive, that her tactics had been necessary because direct complaints were ignored. She noted that no one had cared about human grievances until she forced them to pay attention. Sometimes disruption was the only path to justice. The debate raged across news networks and academic journals. Legal scholars argued about Margaret's methods. Ethicists discussed whether deception in pursuit of justice was acceptable. Sociologists analyzed what the case revealed about power dynamics in the galactic community. The trial had become more than a legal matter. It had become a cultural flashpoint that forced everyone to examine their assumptions. On the human colonies, the impact was immediate and practical. Colonists who had lost land began reclaiming it. Armed with evidence of fraudulent surveys, they went to court with new confidence. Many cases settled quickly because corporations knew they would lose if the cases went to trial. Humans who had been cheated for years finally received justice. Peter Hayes became a symbol of this change. His successful defense inspired thousands of others. New human law schools opened, focusing specifically on galactic legal practice. Enrollment exploded. Talented students who might have pursued other careers chose law instead. They wanted to be like Margaret Cole. They wanted to prove that humans belonged in every courtroom and every legal debate. The next generation of human attorneys would be larger and better trained than ever before. Margaret visited several of these law schools to give lectures. She always emphasized the same points. Master the law better than your opponents. Prepare more thoroughly than anyone else. Never let prejudice make you doubt your abilities. And remember that when you succeed, you open doors for everyone who comes after you. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. 5 months after the trial, Margaret received a message from Judge Bennett. He had completed his ethics review and accepted a suspension from the bench. He was using the time to study human history and culture. He wanted to understand the species he had judged so unfairly. His message asked if Margaret would be willing to meet with him. He had questions, and he hoped she might help him find answers. Margaret agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet cafe on Luna Station and talked for 3 hours. Bennett asked about human experiences in the galactic community. Margaret shared stories of discrimination and frustration. She also shared stories of hope and progress. Bennett listened carefully, taking notes. He said he wanted to write about his experience, to help other judges understand how easily bias could cloud judgment. At the end of the conversation, Bennett thanked Margaret again. He said she had given him a gift even though it had been painful. She had shown him the truth about himself. That was the first step toward becoming better. Margaret told him that growth required courage, and she respected his willingness to change. Not everyone could admit they were wrong. His honesty gave her hope for the future of galactic justice. 6 months after the trial, Margaret stood before the Galactic Court Assembly. This was the governing body that oversaw all judicial matters across member worlds. She had been invited to present her findings from the Ethics Committee investigation. The assembly chamber was enormous, with representatives from over 100 species. Margaret felt the weight of their attention as she prepared to speak. She began by presenting statistics. In cases where both parties were non-human, judges ruled based on evidence 92% of the time. In cases involving humans, the rate dropped to 68%. Human attorneys were interrupted during proceedings 3 times more often than alien attorneys. Human evidence was rejected for technical reasons twice as often. The numbers painted a clear picture of systemic bias. Some representatives objected, claiming the statistics were misleading. They argued that human attorneys were genuinely less experienced with galactic law. Margaret acknowledged this, but showed that even highly credentialed human attorneys faced the same bias. Experience level did not explain the disparity. What explained it was prejudice against a species viewed as newcomers and inferiors. She then played recordings from multiple trials. These were not cherry-picked examples. They were representative samples from courts across the galaxy. In each one, human litigants and attorneys faced dismissive treatment. The pattern was undeniable. When the recordings finished, the chamber was silent. Several representatives looked uncomfortable. They recognized behavior they had witnessed or participated in themselves. Margaret proposed a series of reforms: mandatory bias training for all judges, regular statistical reviews of judicial decisions to identify patterns, stronger protections for litigants to challenge judicial misconduct, creation of special advocates to assist species new to galactic courts. Each proposal was specific and practical. She had spent months developing them with input from legal experts across many species. The debate that followed was intense. Some representatives supported the reforms enthusiastically. Others argued they were unnecessary or too expensive. A few claimed the reforms unfairly targeted certain species or judicial traditions. Margaret listened to all objections and responded calmly with facts and logic. She had prepared for every argument they might make. A senior representative from the Andromedan Confederation asked the question many were thinking. He asked if Margaret believed humans were being singled out or if other species faced similar problems. Margaret said humans were currently the primary victims because they were the newest major species in the community, but the same patterns had affected other species when they first joined. The problem was not unique to humans, but humans were experiencing it now. The representative nodded thoughtfully. He said his own species had faced discrimination when they joined the galactic community 800 years ago. It had taken generations to achieve equal treatment. If these reforms could spare other species that struggle, they were worth implementing. His support shifted the momentum in the chamber. Other representatives began voicing agreement. After 6 hours of debate, the assembly voted. The reforms passed with 73% support. It was a landmark decision that would reshape galactic justice. Margaret felt a surge of emotion but kept her expression neutral. She thanked the assembly and left the chamber with dignity. Only later in private did she allow herself to celebrate. The system was changing and she had helped make it happen. News of the assembly vote spread quickly. Human colonies erupted in celebration. Finally, they would have real protections in galactic courts. Finally, their grievances would be taken seriously. The vote was seen as recognition that humans deserved equal treatment, not as a favor, but as a right. It was a watershed moment in human integration into the galactic community. But Margaret knew the real work was just beginning. Passing reforms was one thing. Implementing them was another. She spent the next months traveling to different judicial centers training judges and court staff. She explained why bias was harmful even when unintentional. She taught practical techniques for recognizing and countering prejudice. The work was exhausting but essential. She also continued investigating specific cases. Her team had identified over 50 judges whose patterns of bias were severe enough to warrant removal. Each case required careful documentation and legal proceedings. Margaret oversaw every detail, making sure the evidence was airtight. She knew that any weakness would be exploited by those who opposed reform. One case involved a judge named Clark Stevens, who had presided over a human colony court for 3 years. During that time, he had ruled against human plaintiffs in 96% of cases. The statistical anomaly was so extreme it suggested deliberate discrimination. Margaret's team gathered testimony from dozens of litigants who described biased treatment. The evidence was overwhelming. Clark fought the charges, claiming he was being targeted for political reasons. He argued that his rulings were based on law, not prejudice. Margaret calmly presented case after case where he had ignored clear evidence in favor of alien parties. She showed his pattern of harsh penalties for humans, compared to light penalties for identical offenses by aliens. The Judicial Review Board removed him from the bench within a month. Each victory like this reinforced the message that bias would no longer be tolerated. Judges across the galaxy began taking the reforms seriously. Statistical reviews showed improvement in treatment of human litigants. The changes were happening faster than Margaret had dared to hope. But she remained cautious. Systemic change was fragile in its early stages. Constant vigilance was needed to prevent backsliding. Meanwhile, human attorneys were thriving in the new environment. Law firms that specialized in galactic practice began opening in major human cities. These firms recruited the brightest graduates and trained them rigorously. Within a year, human attorneys were winning high-profile cases across multiple jurisdictions. Each victory proved that humans could compete on equal footing when given fair treatment. Margaret received countless messages from young attorneys thanking her. They told stories of successful arguments and satisfied clients. They described the respect they received in courtrooms that once would have dismissed them. Many said they had chosen law because of her example. She had shown them that one person with courage and skill could change an entire system. She also heard from Peter Hayes regularly. His farm was thriving, and he had become an advocate for colonist rights. He traveled to different settlements sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for themselves. He always introduced himself as the man whose case had changed everything. Margaret gently corrected him, saying the case had been a catalyst, but the change came from thousands of people working together. The Colonial Development Corporation that had tried to steal Peter's land declared bankruptcy. The lawsuits and criminal charges had destroyed them. Their executives faced prison time on multiple worlds. Their assets were being sold to compensate the colonists they had defrauded. It was a satisfying ending, though Margaret took no joy in anyone's suffering. She simply believed in accountability and consequences. A year after the trial, Margaret was approached by the Galactic Court Assembly again. They wanted to create a new position, a permanent special advocate for species equity, who would monitor judicial fairness and investigate complaints. They wanted Margaret to take the role. It would give her authority to continue the work she had started with full institutional support. Margaret considered the offer carefully. It was an enormous responsibility. She would be a permanent watchdog, which would make her many enemies, but it was also an opportunity to ensure the reforms actually worked, to build systems that would outlast any individual. She accepted the position knowing it would define the rest of her career. Her first act as special advocate was to establish regional offices on 20 different worlds. Each office would have investigators and legal experts who could respond quickly to complaints. No litigant should have to wait months for help when facing bias. The network of offices would make justice accessible to everyone regardless of where they lived. She also created a database of judicial decisions that anyone could access. Transparency was crucial for accountability. If judges knew their decisions would be reviewed statistically, they would be more careful about bias. The database included analysis tools that could identify patterns automatically. It was a powerful weapon against discrimination hidden in seemingly neutral rulings. The work consumed Margaret's life, but she did not mind. She had found her purpose. Every night she went to bed knowing she had helped someone that day. Every morning she woke up ready to fight for fairness. The simple woman with the old briefcase had become one of the most powerful figures in galactic justice. But she never forgot where she started or why she did this work. On the anniversary of the trial, Margaret visited Kepler 9 again. She stood outside the courthouse where it had all happened. The station had erected a small plaque commemorating the case. It listed the key facts and the outcome. Margaret read it and smiled. The plaque did not mention her by name. It focused on Peter Hayes and his victory. That was exactly right. This had never been about her. It had been about justice for everyone. 5 years had passed since the trial that changed everything. Margaret Cole stood on a stage at the Grand Assembly Hall on Earth, addressing the graduating class of the Galactic Law Academy. This was the first law school dedicated exclusively to training human attorneys for galactic practice. 200 graduates sat before her wearing their ceremonial robes. Behind them sat proud families who had supported these young people through years of rigorous study. Margaret looked out at the faces and saw the future. These graduates would take positions in courts across the galaxy. They would represent human interests and fight for justice. More importantly, They would do it without having to disguise themselves or prove their worth through elaborate schemes. The playing field was more level now. Not perfect, but better. These young attorneys would build on the foundation she and others had created. She began her speech by talking about the old briefcase she had carried into Judge Bennett's courtroom. She explained how it had been a symbol of lowered expectations, a prop to make her seem harmless and unthreatening. She said she hoped none of them would ever need such props, but she also warned them that prejudice still existed even if it was less blatant than before. They would face doubters and skeptics. Their job was to be so prepared and so skilled that doubt became impossible. The graduates listened intently. Many of them had chosen law specifically because of Margaret's example. They knew her story by heart. The simple woman who had outsmarted an entire courtroom, the investigator who had exposed systemic bias, the advocate who had reformed galactic justice. She was a legend, but standing before them she seemed remarkably normal. That was part of her power. She proved that extraordinary things could be done by ordinary people with determination. Margaret told them about some of the cases she had worked on over the past 5 years. She described victories and defeats. She emphasized that losing a case did not mean failing as an attorney. Sometimes the law itself was unjust and needed to be changed. Sometimes judges made mistakes despite best efforts to be fair. What mattered was fighting with integrity and learning from every experience. She encouraged them to be resilient because the work ahead would not be easy. After the ceremony, Margaret met with several graduates individually. A young woman named Patricia Hill asked for advice about handling a difficult judge. Margaret suggested documenting every interaction and finding patterns that might indicate bias. She reminded Patricia that statistical evidence was powerful because it was hard to argue with numbers. If a judge ruled differently in similar cases based on species, that pattern told a story. A graduate named Christopher Lane asked about working for the ethics committee. He wanted to investigate judicial misconduct like Margaret had done. She told him the work was important but emotionally draining. Investigators saw the worst of the system constantly. It could lead to cynicism if you were not careful. She advised him to balance investigation work with positive experiences, to remember why the work mattered and who it helped. Margaret spent hours talking with the graduates. She gave each person her full attention and thoughtful advice. These conversations energized her. The passion and idealism of young attorneys reminded her why she had fought so hard to create opportunities for them. They would carry the work forward when she eventually stepped aside. The movement for justice was bigger than any individual now. That evening, Margaret returned to her office to find a message waiting. It was from Judge Bennett. He had completed his suspension and was returning to the bench. But he had requested assignment to a different type of court. He wanted to work in the newly created Species Equity Court that heard cases involving discrimination and bias. He asked if Margaret thought he was ready for that responsibility. Margaret thought about the question carefully. Bennett had spent 5 years in genuine reflection and growth. He had studied human culture extensively. He had written a widely praised book about recognizing and overcoming judicial bias. He had become an advocate for reform, speaking at legal conferences across the galaxy. His transformation seemed authentic. She sent a reply saying she believed he had earned a second chance, and she supported his assignment to the Equity Court. The next day, Margaret received another message. This one was from the Galactic Court Assembly. They informed her that the reforms she had championed were showing measurable results. Human litigants now won cases at statistically similar rates to other species. Complaints of judicial bias had decreased by 70%. Satisfaction with the court system among human colonists had increased dramatically. The numbers proved the reforms were working, but the message also contained a warning. Some political factions were pushing to roll back the reforms. They argued the changes had gone too far and created unfair advantages for humans. There would be votes in the assembly that could undo years of progress. Margaret would need to defend the reforms publicly and vigorously. The fight was not over. Margaret prepared for another round of advocacy. She gathered data showing that improved outcomes for humans had not harmed other species. The reforms had simply created fairness. She compiled testimony from judges who said the training had made them better at their jobs. She found examples of non-human litigants who had also benefited from increased oversight of judicial conduct. The evidence was strong, but she knew evidence alone did not always win political battles. She organized a coalition of supporters, including human rights groups. progressive alien organizations, and legal reform advocates. They coordinated messaging and lobbying efforts. They held public forums to educate people about why the reforms mattered. They shared stories of individuals whose lives had been changed by fairer courts. The campaign was sophisticated and well-funded. Margaret had learned that changing systems required political skill as much as legal expertise. The assembly vote took place 3 months later. Margaret sat in the gallery watching as representatives debated. Some speeches were eloquent defenses of justice and equality. Others were thinly veiled expressions of prejudice and resentment. The debate revealed how much work remained to change hearts and minds. But when the vote came, the reforms were upheld by a solid majority. The progress would continue. Margaret celebrated quietly that night with close colleagues. They toasted the victory but acknowledged the ongoing challenges. Systemic change was a marathon, not a sprint. There would always be resistance from those who benefited from the old ways. Vigilance would be needed for years or decades. But the direction was right and the momentum was building. She thought about Peter Hayes and his small farm on Kepler 9. His simple desire to keep the land he had worked was what started everything. One colonist facing one unjust claim had become a catalyst for galaxy-wide reform. It showed how individual acts of courage could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Margaret had helped amplify those ripples, but she had not created them. The desire for justice existed in people across all species. Her role was simply to channel that desire into effective action. Over the following years, Margaret continued her work as special advocate. She investigated hundreds of cases and trained thousands of judges. She wrote articles and gave speeches. She mentored young attorneys and supported reform movements. The work became her life, and she had no regrets about that choice. Some people spent their lives pursuing wealth or fame. Margaret pursued fairness, and she found deep satisfaction in it. On Earth, a movement began to erect monuments honoring her contributions. Margaret resisted these efforts. She argued that monuments should honor ideas, not individuals. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A statue was built, but it did not depict Margaret specifically. Instead, it showed a simple woman with a briefcase representing all those who fought for justice while appearing powerless. The inscription read that underestimating any being was a mistake because potential existed everywhere. Margaret attended the statue unveiling in a small Oregon town. Thousands of people gathered for the ceremony. When she was asked to speak, she kept her remarks brief. She said the statue represented something important, that dignity and capability were not determined by appearance or species or status, that every person deserved to be judged by their actions and character, that justice required seeing past assumptions to recognize the truth. These were simple principles, but putting them into practice required constant effort. The crowd applauded, and Margaret stepped back from the microphone. She looked at the statue and thought about that day in Bennett's courtroom years ago. She had walked in wearing old clothes and carrying a worn briefcase. She had let everyone underestimate her. And then she had shown them what humans could do when given a fair chance. The memory still gave her satisfaction, not because she had deceived people, but because she had proven a point that needed proving. As the ceremony ended and people began to leave, Margaret stood quietly looking at the statue. A young girl approached her shyly. The girl said she wanted to be a lawyer like Margaret when she grew up. Margaret knelt down to the girl's level and asked why. The girl said because she wanted to help people who were treated unfairly. Margaret smiled and told her that was the best reason to become a lawyer. She encouraged the girl to work hard and never let anyone make her doubt herself.